Thank you all for coming along. I know in Queensland it's week 10, and we also know that in Victoria things have been very hectic again for you guys this term with your schooling situation. So I appreciate you giving up your time to come along. So this is the third cafe for this term, and this term has kept a common theme around inclusive curriculum provision and differentiating curriculum and making curriculum adjustments at the different NCCD tiers, which is about the intensity of curriculum adjustment. So this is the third and final wrap up in this little mini series. So I appreciate you coming along to hear about substantial and extensive curriculum adjustments this time. So just going over some protocols around your participation in this webinar. So we ask that video and microphone are off during the presentation process. This helps with bandwidth and maintaining connection for those of us that don't have a strong bandwidth, but also reduces any background noise and distraction coming from participants as well. But we will go into breakout rooms, and you're welcome to turn either of your video or your microphone on so you can interact in there. And the breakout rooms are separate from the main presentation. So no one else can see or hear what's going on in your individual breakout room, and it's not included in the recording either. So please feel free to understand that that is a safe space where you can turn on the microphone and video and engage openly with other participants in there. The main form of communicating with me is through the chat. Being mindful of the fact that I am also presenting, so I'm not always looking at the chat window, though I will monitor it, and please enter any questions that you have. And when you go in the breakout rooms, that gives me an opportunity to go back and really check over that chat and pick up on any specific questions that you might have. So please enter them in at any time, even though you know that I may not be looking at it in the moment that you're entering it. There may be an opportunity to engage with some of the reactions buttons. So you'll find on your taskbar for Zoom that you've got some options there. And as I mentioned, we are recording, and all of the past cafe sessions, including this one, go up onto my website, which you can see along the bottom of the PowerPoint, and they're accessible there with the supporting resources that we use. So I provide any of the handouts and a copy of the slides as well. So you're welcome to go and check those out. And each one has had well over 300 views. So people are accessing those after the fact, which is fantastic, particularly given that not everyone can come along to the live version. So please go and use those, show staff, etc., whenever you have the opportunity to do that. For the sake of anyone who's on here that might be new, or people watching the recording afterwards, I'm Lauren Swancutt, and I'm the creator of the School Inclusion from Theory to Network website that you see, and where these cafe recordings are housed. I'm also the national convener of the School Inclusion Network for Educators, which is an official network of All Means All, the Australian Alliance for Inclusive Education, which is a registered organisation of like-minded professionals who have come together to help advance inclusive education across Australia. So there's an academics network and a parent network, and I head up the educators network. So if you're not joining us via Sign, please look us up on Facebook and opt to join that closed network if you like. So you do have to request to join, and therefore things that happen within the public as well. But it's a great place to collaborate, share ideas, ask questions, etc. My real day job, my full-time employment, is as Head of Inclusive Schooling at a state high school here in North Queensland, and I'm also a new doctoral candidate through the Queensland University of Technology, where my research focus is on inclusive curriculum provision. So just starting that, just my first year as a part-time student, and really enjoying it so far. The purpose of our cafe sessions is to give us an opportunity to engage in some more informal or relaxed professional learning around topics relating to inclusive education. So they were once designed as face-to-face delivery, but bringing them online allows a greater number of participants, but also I'm not just bound to delivering it in my local geographical area. So it allows people from every state and every system to come and join in with us, which has been a really exciting advancement of the cafe space. So it is designed to be succinct. We do only have a short time frame together. And it's also meant to be heavily focused on actual practice. So although there is a little bit of theory discussion to underpin what we go through, the main focus of the cafes is actually to demonstrate the fundamental concepts of inclusive education and how they can actually be implemented in contextual practice in schools. And then also the other element is collaboration. So there's opportunity for participants throughout the cafe to go into breakout rooms and to interact with one another around the content and other challenges of practice that they may be experiencing in their school contexts. As I mentioned at the beginning, this focus is the third instalment of what has occurred across this term. So we've been looking at that broad picture of inclusive curriculum provision, and we looked at gaining understanding of the actual curriculum intent for a grade level unit of study. And that's a really important aspect. We can't go on to make decisions around differentiation and adjustments without having that really strong understanding of what the curriculum is actually demanding at the grade level. So the first instalment was around that. The second instalment then looked at how we make differentiation decisions and universal design decisions to that curriculum intent, and then some supplementary adjustments which aren't yet impacting on what that grade level curriculum intent is. Today we're moving to that next layer around substantial and extensive adjustments, where we will still stick with the age equivalent content and the age equivalent curriculum, but looking at how we make complexity adjustments to that to support students who may be accessing curriculum at a different year level juncture and students who may be accessing some individualised goals. So this work centres on teachers having capability which comes from them also having knowledge. So it's a two-pronged approach. So in order to follow through with making good quality differentiated decisions and universal design, and then on to making appropriate adjustments beyond that, teachers need to have good knowledge around the flexibility of our standards-based curriculum, and whether you are accessing the Australian curriculum or if you are in New South Wales or Victoria, all three of those curriculums are standards-based curriculum designs. And standard-based curriculum design is actually developed in a way that has a lot of flexibility in that to ensure that those curriculums are responsive to the full diversity of students that exist in our education systems. So teachers need to be aware of what that means and what those flexibility measures are built into that curriculum so that they are able to use it to extend to that full diversity and allow all students to access their age equivalent curriculum. So there's the knowledge about those components and the ways of working with the curriculum, and then there's the actual follow through and the implementation of the practices that bring that to life in a diverse classroom in an inclusive, under an inclusive lens. So it's a two-pronged, and as I said, the cafe's focused more on that actual practice. But of course, when I'm demonstrating the practice, I'll be referring to some of that knowledge around the flexibility of the standards-based curriculum as we go. Be mindful of the time and the purpose of the cafe. So sometimes people come in thinking they're going to, get the full extent of every bit of knowledge, understanding and practice that you need to walk away, but we will only have about an hour together. So you're going to get a very small slither and a small taste of what it looks like. It will be enough to give you an idea of what the follow through into practice is, and hopefully to whet your appetite around finding out more and actually then going forth and having a play around in this space yourself with your own students and your own curriculum that you're delivering. So there will be some small modelling from me through an I do phase, and then some small opportunity to do some guided practice together in the breakout session. So it is just a taste. This work does take time for you to build a high level of knowledge and understanding and a high level of practice around it. And it's certainly more suited to actually doing it with your real context, so your real class and your real curriculum, and having a coach walk along beside you to build your capability and gradually release that capability over to you. So certainly something to explore further, but you'll get a little bit of taste of what that is today. The session will be broken into 4 main parts. So we'll start by reconnecting with some of the content that's come before us, just to get us refocused on where we're coming. Because as I said, this level of adjustment sits beyond high quality curriculum understanding and delivery at the age equivalent point. So when we've actually exhausted making that option accessible to students, that's when we then look for curriculum adjustment. It isn't our first go-to. So it's important that we go back to that and reconnect with what that is, to then understand where this next layer of support fits into that process. And we'll also have a little bit of an opportunity to get to say good day and have a chat to one another before we delve into the content. So not only connecting with the stuff from previous webinars, but connecting with one another as well. The next section is explore. So that's where you'll see me modelling the process of making substantial and extensive curriculum adjustments. Then the main breakout session will be around you practicing that as a group, and then finishing up with some reflection and some question time around that as well. So a reminder to pop any question in at any point. And as I said, I will check over that at opportunities that I get while you're in breakout rooms, and then we can talk more deeply about that toward the end as well. So the first little section is popping you into a breakout room. So if you haven't participated before, you'll get a little message that comes up on your screen that you will need to accept. And that sends you out into another room where only the participants in that little room can hear and see what's going on in there. And the purpose of this one is just to give you an opportunity to connect with people who are across different states, across different systems, in different towns, different context, etc., and start some of that collaborative conversation. So to support you in that, there is a stimulus question, but you don't have to stick to it. It can just be an opportunity to say good day to one another and learn about where each of you are from and what context you're working in. But if you do need something to stimulate, this is a little bit of a lead in, as you can see, around to what today's topic is about. So talking about whether or not you are confident in including students with complex learning profiles in their age equivalent curriculum. So is it something that you've had experience in? Is it something that you're doing now? Is it a priority area for you to learn about? Are things already going really well in this space for you, etc.? Are some of the things that you can talk about in your little groups. So I'll just go to the controls and pause the record for us now, and then hit the buttons to send you out. If anyone gets stuck, all right, so moving into that first phase of the presentation where we can reconnect with some of the content that's occurred in the previous two webinars that really give a good, strong foundation to what we're then following through with today. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the first session was around gaining clarity of the curriculum intent at the age equivalent level. So we looked at Year 4 English and Year 7 Science. So what is it that Year 4 English are needing to know and do? And what is it that Year 7 Science we're needing to know and do? So getting a really strong foundation around what that curriculum intent was. So then into the second session, we looked at applying quality differentiated practice and some universal design. And then the next layer of supplementary adjustments, which doesn't yet impact on that grade level curriculum intent. So that's left us with what's highlighted in the yellow, which is obviously today's focus on the substantial and extensive curriculum adjustments and how we go through the process of applying those to that strong foundation that we already have through the know, do, think process, and then building on top of differentiation and supplementary adjustments. So to just re-jog our memory, it's been a few weeks since we engaged with it, so I'll just gloss over that content and then we'll go a bit deeper in it when we go through that first process of making substantial adjustments. So you saw in the highlighting that the first one ticked off quite a number of the steps in the process, and as I mentioned, that's because it's the really strong foundation that we need in order to then move forward with differentiation and adjustments. So what you're seeing on the screen is ultimately what I unpacked with people through that first webinar. So the actual, my thinking and doing process around how I gain curriculum clarity, and we went through each of those first 7 steps in the implementation guide and what that actually looked like, leading us up to creating that know, do, think. So for Year 7 Science, it was around the unit relating to food webs, and feeding relationships and the impact of human and natural impacts on that food web and what that does to them. So students have to be able to construct a food web and predict the effect of human and environmental changes on the feeding relationships within food webs. So we unpack that through the know, do and think process. And we also did the same thing for Year 4 English, where we were looking at persuasive advertising. And you'll see that it's just a snippet of the curriculum. There's obviously more content involved when we're doing a whole unit of study, but given the time constraints that we have on these webinars, just choosing a section of the content from the unit as a demonstration of those processes. So in this particular unit, looking at persuasive elements of advertising in Year 4, we just honed in on the use of images in particular for this demonstration. So we went through the steps of the process of how we gain that clarity and how we get that information that exists there on the know, do, think table. And that involves accessing various aspects of the Australian curriculum or the corresponding elements of the New South Wales and Victorian curriculums. From there, we went through and into the second webinar was then taking that content that we had engaged with and looking at how we could apply quality differentiated teaching practice and supplementary adjustments to it. So again, we went through some thinking and doing processes as a classroom teacher, looking at what the diversity in our classroom is, what the students come with and what they bring, and then looked at what the predictability is around that diversity. So what are the impacts and barriers that exist for those students in relation to the curriculum, and how we can respond universally to reduce those barriers at the outset, and how we can take that content and the curriculum and its intent, and without upsetting that or changing that in any way, what are our instructional practices and what are the supports and scaffolds that we can provide around that open it up to that diversity in our classrooms. We then went through the process of some key practices that we can do at the differentiated and supplementary level, which allow us to make that curriculum more accessible to students and allows them to participate in it and make progress in it without interrupting that intent, as I mentioned. So looking at particularly the literacy and the language demands and the hidden barriers that they pose, which actually prevent students from demonstrating their true knowledge and understanding around the actual content that we are teaching them. So we looked at options of how we could adjust those or differentiate those. We looked at providing multiple means to engage with the content, again, to help support the diversity that we have in our classrooms. Incorporating some choice and flexibility, which helps to engage students and to support their self-regulation through the content. Making it active and cooperative, so opportunities for them to engage with one another and to also do the learning through some hands-on components and actual practice. And then also looking at the supports and scaffolds that can be put in place and gradually released to ensure that students come the end of the unit have the knowledge and skills that they need to then demonstrate that learning onto the summative assessment task. And we did that through the lens of universal design. So although we might have made some of those decisions with particular students in mind, we looked at how we could actually just implement them as the quality first teaching that's then provided to the class as a whole. And we looked at how to document those things onto that know, do, think process by extending that to demonstrate the differentiation that could occur and the supplementary adjustments, which of course with a real class and a real context in mind could then be further personalised as well. And we spoke about incorporating those things through those key universal design principles around choice, using interests, bringing in multimodal, so not only having one way to engage with content or demonstrate learning, and the important aspect of supporting the literacy throughout that process as well. And then we also looked at the assessment task of how we might actually design that differently to what we generally see assessment tasks looking like, to ensure that they do respond to that diversity in our classrooms and that we're addressing those predictable barriers that we're already aware of from the outset and supplementing those. And in the breakout session, people had the opportunity to go away and review the assessment that's there, but then also make some additional differentiation and supplementary considerations around that assessment task as well. And then we went and did the same thing with the Year 4 English, and in the breakout groups, people went away and actually established for themselves what differentiation and supplementary adjustments could occur for that particular level of content in Year 4 English. So moving on now to looking at substantial and extensive adjustments, which is the focus of this webinar particularly. So in the beginning, we looked at the progression of adjustments and how they change across those tiers that we are familiar with from the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability. So we know that the two elements that relate to the tiers and their differences is around frequency and intensity. So you can see there that substantial adjustments are things that occur most of the time on most days with a high level of action, and that extensive adjustments are ones that occur all of the time with a high level of action. And then we also have the intensity of that support. So we're now up to the level in substantial adjustments where we're actually have exhausted the level of support at the differentiated and supplementary level. And we're now looking to provide the same content at a different complexity level by providing access to an alternate point on the sequence of achievement from our curriculums. And then the next layer beyond that being extensive adjustments is that we are opening that content up for students via individual learning goals, which are derived prior to the foundation level of curriculum. So the other important aspect, as I've mentioned on the fly in the previous slides, is that these things occur in addition to differentiation, universal design, and supplementary adjustments. So we're not jumping straight to this level of support, and students who are accessing substantial adjustments may also be still accessing supplementary adjustments around the levels of scaffolding, the literacy supports, etc. So it's a build upon accumulative effect in relation to the adjustments that we are providing, starting with that high quality differentiated content from the clarity we've developed in the beginning. So I mentioned at the start that the three curriculums in Australia are the Australian curriculum, the New South Wales curriculum, and the Victorian curriculum. And we're fortunate that they're all standards-based curriculum designs. So although they have different terminology and different things within them, the way that they're designed is very similar, and the way that they can be used and implemented with that flexibility around student diversity is the same, but there is different terminology. So I've just got on the screen some of the differences. If you are from Victoria and New South Wales, I will speak in Australian curriculum language. It is our national curriculum, but it's also the curriculum implemented here in Queensland. So just be mindful that you might need to think about what that terminology is in your different curriculums if you're from those states. So the process absolutely still applies. You're just going to have to tweak some of the language around the steps and the things you might hear me speak about. We went through this in more depth in the first webinar around that flexibility of standards-based curriculum design. So standards-based curriculum is broad curriculum goals around what students need to know and do to be successful in that curriculum. They deliberately leave out deeper context and particular context around the performance of that knowledge and skills. And that is so that it does remain as a responsive curriculum to diverse student populations. So you won't find in there that the student must do such and such via a 70-minute essay in week 10 of term 3. So it's that layering on of those additional conditions that I just mentioned that actually prevent curriculum from being universally accessible to all students. And they're actually decisions that schools make. So through that clarity process, that's where we really go back to what is the curriculum actually demanding, and that it is actually allowing us opportunity to have students engage with that content and demonstrate that learning in a variety of ways. And that is done through the learning areas, so the traditional subjects that we're typically used to when we think of curriculum, such as English, maths, science, etc. The general capabilities, the cross-curricular priorities, and a more recent addition around the learning progressions. And it's their components within that, being the sequence of achievement, the sequence of content, the learning continuums and the progression maps, that we're able to apply differentiation, supplementary, substantial and extensive adjustments to those standards that are being dictated by what students need to know and be able to do. So before we go into looking at applying the substantial level, we're making a lot of assumptions as we enter into this space. And this is stuff that I cover in more depth when there's more of a focus on the actual knowledge and understanding around making curriculum adjustments. This focus today is more on that practical application, but still important to connect with these assumptions that we are making that have occurred or are sitting with teachers when they go through the process of making substantial and extensive adjustments. So high expectations should always be forefronted. We shouldn't automatically jump to assumptions that a student needs substantial and extensive. So it is about high expectations for all kids and unlocking that age equivalent opportunity to ensure that we are not limiting their potential in any way. So accessing age equivalent content and academic curriculum is really important for students with disability, including those with significant cognitive disabilities or complex learning profiles. So we will still often hear the debate around life skills or functional curriculum for students. Those skills are still very important and can actually be delivered alongside academic instruction. And what we know from lots and lots of research is that students, even with the most significant cognitive disabilities, can very much access and participate in academic curriculum and also make progress in academic curriculum. And in other presentations, we go a bit deeper into the importance of providing academic curriculum to students with disability, because if we don't, we're making assumptions about the value and potential of those people in our society and already limiting their life experiences and beyond the school gates based on what we assume someone with a significant disability can do in their lives. So really important that we do value academic curriculum for all of our students. I've already touched on it providing the opportunity that we actually open up year level experiences for students to support their potential and for them to direct that potential, that we're not already coming in with some bias or some prejudice around what we think some students are and are not capable of doing. We are also assuming that that quality teaching and universal design aspect is happening when we're coming to the level of substantial and extensive adjustments, and that differentiation and supplementary adjustments have already been identified and are being implemented, and that this is the actual needed next step for some students, and that there has been a rigorous process around checks and balances to ensure that good quality differentiation and supplementary adjustments have been implemented with frequency and fidelity, and that this next layer is absolutely needed, and that it's not just being put in place because we haven't gone back to building some capability and following through with some really good instructional decisions before this point. So when we're talking about curriculum and making adjustments, there's 5 C's that impact on it all. So we have the curriculum itself, and a fundamental concept of inclusive education is that all students have access to their age equivalent content and experience. And that stays for students who are accessing substantial and extensive adjustments. The next thing is the cognition. So when we're at this point, at this level of adjustment, we are altering the access point of the cognitive demand. So the content is staying the same, but we are impacting on the complexity of how they're engaging in and demonstrating that content and that experience. The context stays the same or is tweaked slightly based on the further information that's provided to us in the content descriptions. So that's, for example, where we find out that in relation to the Year 7 science content that it's about food webs. So it doesn't explicitly say food webs in the achievement standard. It talks more about that concept of how animals are impacted by human and natural phenomena that happen. But the context comes from the content descriptions, which tells us that that's actually about food webs and how food webs are impacted when a bushfire comes through, etc. Complexity is the quality of performance or the judgment that we make about what the student has produced. So it's typically an A to E scale, though I know some systems and some schools might operate on a different A to E, but I'm sure it's probably the most common 5-point scale that's utilised in schools to make a judgment about the quality of a student's performance and what complexity they're actually demonstrating to us around that content. And then the conditions come in. And it's really important to have a universal design lens over that, because as I mentioned, standards-based curriculum doesn't dictate to us the how the student has to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding. So we can get a bit caught up in the status quo, particularly in high schools, around, you know, having formal assessments and essay style assessments. The curriculum doesn't actually demand that, and that might not actually be responsive to the students that we have. So looking at putting a universal lens over the conditions of assessment tasks is really important for all kids, but particularly for students accessing substantial and extensive adjustments as well. So what you're now going to see is my modelling of these processes being applied to the Year 7 science content, and then I'm going to leave you to have a practice on that Year 4 English content with some supports that I provided in the handouts. So our first point of call is to connect, and we're assuming we wouldn't have weeks of gap between doing these processes like we have with the webinar. So we're making the assumption that we do very much remember what the Year 7 science content is and that we've just engaged in the clarity process of that. So we're very clear about this food web stuff and what kids need to know and do to be successful. So you have to have that right in your head and be confident around what the Year 7 curriculum is actually demanding. And then the next step in relation to substantial adjustments is looking at what the equivalent of that is at the earlier access point that we are focusing on. So what we do is we access the sequence of achievement from our curriculums, and it might be called something, remember, a little bit different for New South Wales and Victoria, but ultimately it's the scope of what that content looks like from foundation or prep through to Year 10. So we can access that document, and in relation to Year 7 science, it's around predicting the effect of human and environmental changes on interactions between organisms. So we find that in the biological science. And then this example, we're going back to Year 3. So what does biological science look like at Year 3 to give us the difference in content complexity? So the first C around curriculum and content from that list of 5 Cs we just went through. And so at the Year 3 level, it's looking at grouping living things based on observable features and distinguishing them from non-living things. So we're already finding some complexity difference. So kids being able to predict in Year 7 to students being able to group if we're accessing a Year 3 complexity. So we engage with that and we understand that, which might involve some collaboration, of course, through this process. And the collaboration is highly recommended. So you've got someone there to talk this through and talk about it and build your confidence and capability around it. So the next step in the process, and what I like to do when I'm going through it, and as you saw earlier in the presentation, you actually saw the screenshots of my handwriting where I have literally gone through and done this process for these 2 curriculum areas in the presentation, is looking at what is the main content of Year 7, and we did this in a previous step to inform what we then write in the know and do. So we go back and reconnect with that. So it's predicting in Year 7, it's reading and interpreting food webs, and within that reading and interpretation, it's really pulling apart interactions, relationships, and the role of microorganisms. And all this information comes from the content descriptions and their elaborations. They then have to be able to construct a food web and then talk about those effects of human activity and invasive species. So now at this level of substantial adjustment, I'm going back to that content with my Year 3 access point. So with its achievement standard component, with its associated content descriptions and their elaborations, and looking at what that looks like at the Year 3 access point. So as I mentioned, they're not predicting, but they're grouping. And from the further curriculum information, I know that they need to be able to recognise different characteristics of animals or organisms. They need to be able to explore those differences. And it talks about knowing the difference between living, once living, and products. We're then looking at being able to group interactions between organisms. So instead of constructing food webs, they are grouping the organisms that are represented on food webs. And it talks about the students being able to understand and acknowledge the sensitivities of living things, which lends itself nicely to when we then move into the content around human and invasive species impacts on animals and food webs and what those sensitivities are. So that's the first thing that I do, is kind of jot out and align the differences in complexity around the content that we're interacting with. That then helps us turn it into some knowing and doing statements on the know, do, think table process. So in this substantial adjustment column, you're representing what this content and what this context, so it's still about food webs, it's still about the Year 7 content, because that's what's occurring in the inclusive classroom and the student has to be a part of that to be included in the curriculum. We're looking at what that complexity difference is. So in this instance, instead of predicting and constructing food webs, they're looking at the fact and knowing that organisms can be grouped based on observable features, and that we will then follow through with getting them to group animals from the context of food webs, which they're going to be engaging with based on those differences and characteristics. So again, taking that terminology and that curriculum intent straight from the curriculum itself, keeping the year level content and context around it. And then in that second layer, being able to distinguish between natural and human impacts. So distinguishing is a cognitive demand that's straight from the Year 3 access point and is documented in the content descriptions. And then being able to recognise animal sensitivities toward both natural and human impacts. So that shows us the difference, the slight tweak or change that will occur to the complexity level of the student accessing Year 3 adjustments when they're engaging in food web content in the classroom and the assessment item. So when it comes to the assessment, we come back to the 5 C's, and some of it stays the same, but then of course we use some of the C's to make the changes that we need for that complexity. So it stays as food webs. Their assessment is still going to be about food webs. It is the content that's being taught to them across the unit with the changes that we just saw in relation to the complexity. So instead of, constructing a food web, when it comes to that point in lessons, they are then grouping animals from the food webs that they would have engaged with through the teaching and learning process. The cognition has changed. So I'm swapping out the predicting word and bringing in the grouping cognitive demand for them. The context stays the same. So it's still about food webs, but as you saw, it's about differences and characteristics and some of that other context that comes from the Year 3 content descriptions. And their range of performance. So as I said, we're taking out the predicting and we're bringing in the grouping. So there's still going to be an A to E range of performance, but it will be slightly different. And I'll show you that in a moment. And then I'm going to think about my universal design. So I should have and hopefully have already done a really good universal design assessment, but students accessing substantial adjustments may need something further than that as well. So I'm then thinking about my assessment, about changing the questions to reflect the new level of complexity that I've understood, but also I might need to change some of the conditions. There might need to be a scribe, it might need to be done on a different day, it might need to be broken up and only one section done a week. There's going to be an actual student, a human being involved in this process that's going to have some different aspects that they need applied personally. So that will change when we're actually thinking about a real student. So I've gone through and looked at that. So this was the example that we played around with in the previous webinar. But again, the students are going through and drawing out what the species are eating, and then they are constructing a food web to show what species are eating what. So in relation to this student accessing Year 3, they would still have something very similar, but instead of putting it into a food web, they would be grouping the animals that are there based on some differences and some characteristics. So we might actually get them to do a couple of different grouping activities through that process. In terms of the range of performance and the marking guide, so again, it all comes from the C's that we've been referring to. So we're keeping the content, so it's still going to be about food webs. So we're changing from predicting to grouping. And then that further information around what they're doing with the food webs comes from the content descriptions. So when we're looking at a marking guide for this particular section of the Know and Do for the Year 7 Science unit for a student accessing Year 3, the C comes straight from the achievement standard, straight from the curriculum. And then the cognitive demand stays the same. It's the quality of the interaction with that cognitive demand that varies across the A to E. So you'll see that groups animals from food webs. So I've added in the context of food webs based on observable features is the stuff dictated to us from the achievement standard. The way that they do that and to the, the complexity and the quality that they do that is then changing. So just being able to group animals from a food web to then grouping them based on a feature, doing it based on observable features. Wow, that was a tongue tie. Then being able to do that on a selection and a combination. So can we get a bit more fancy with our groupings on multiple characteristics perhaps? And then going again, bringing in interactions as a further level of going beyond that level of complexity around grouping for students as well. So providing opportunities for that. I'm going to pause for a moment and just check the chat. I know there's a few things in there and just give you an opportunity to prepare that we will now go into the breakout rooms and give you an opportunity to practice some of that with the Year 4 content. But I will take you through what that breakout session will look like for you. But just give me a moment while I cast my eyes over here on the chat. Yes, so that question comes up quite frequently. So we're only talking about curriculum adjustments here. So you may have students in your school that are counted in substantial and extensive adjustments, but are still accessing the grade level content. It might be for a health or physical reason, for example. So we have a student who uses a wheelchair and has some substantial adjustment needs around her mobility and her health and toileting support in the school, but she still accesses her regular curriculum. So when I'm talking about substantial and extensive adjustments here, it is specifically about curriculum adjustments. So if you are accessing substantial curriculum adjustments, you are accessing a different access point, a different complexity level than your peers, and extensive adjustments is about individual learning goals. So you are in the supplementary category if you are not accessing a different access point or individual goals, for example. You may, as I mentioned, then have other substantial and extensive needs around communication, physical supports, all of that sort of stuff that then might bump you into that category outside of that. No, so it's about frequency and intensity. So it's not one or the other. So you're definitely accessing an alternate access point to be classed as substantial adjustments. So there's just some clarity around that. Feel free to drop some more questions in if you have more, would like some more information around that. So I'll just take you through the breakout room little sheet handout that you have, the tasks that you're going to be doing. I've given you the Year 4, so that's looking at the images used in a persuasive text. I've given you the main concepts and content. So you saw how I draw that out for Year 7 Science. I had that written down first, so I've given you that as well. And then a bit of an overview about what you're going to do, as well as the bits of information that you need from the achievement standards to do it. So the first step is looking at that change in complexity. So in cognition, sorry. So that's looking at how we went from predict to group. So you've got the little snips of the achievement standard there relating to this persuasive advertising stuff in Year 4. So looking at what is the difference in the cognitive verb or the cognitive demand from Year 4 to Year 1. So that's your first little bit of discussion. Then you're looking at what that means in relation to the context. So they're doing that persuasive images stuff at the Year 4 level. So reading the rest of the Year 1 achievement standard and what they need to do, how does that apply to that context of images in advertising? And then looking at pulling that together in a statement that can go on the no-do think table to represent that different level of complexity for the student accessing Year 1. So I'll pop you back into your breakout rooms and leave you with about 10 minutes so that you've got a good opportunity to connect with that and read through it and come up with some ideas. And when we come back together, we'll go through and share what the stuff is that we came up with. So give me a moment while I pause the recording and get you back into your rooms. So now you've had an opportunity to go through that process a little bit in the breakout rooms. Remember, again, it's a very small slither, very small opportunity. So you're not expected to become the experts all of a sudden on what you did. So please still feel confident to pop some responses in the chat. We understand that this is new concepts to people, so don't be frightened to share what you did come up with. So the first question was around what is the variance in cognition at a Year 1 access point. So if you could pop in the chat what you spoke about there and what you came up with. So what is the cognitive verb or the cognitive demand that's occurring at Year 4, and what is the version that's occurring at the Year 1 access point? Yep, so Year 4 is explain and Year 1 is make connections. Excellent. So that's the first step. So when we're talking about images in persuasive advertisements, students at Year 4 are explaining them, and the student accessing the Year 1 access point is making connections with it, which then leads into the next step. So what does the context look like when we combine that, the making connections component, with what they're doing in class? So in Year 4, they're explaining language features, images and vocabulary and how they're used to engage the interests of audience. And in this particular context, how those things are used in advertisements to rope in buyers. And in Year 4, it's around making connections to personal experiences when looking at characters and main events, etc. So in this context, when looking at images in persuasive advertisements. So when the two collide, what would it look like in the knowing and do table? You can type in some ideas around what the student at the Year 1 access point needs to know in relation to images of persuasive advertisements and what they need to do with those. Yep, so making connections with the images. So they might be presented the images around persuasive texts, and instead of explaining those aspects like the framing, the placement, etc., like they are at Year 4, they might just be identifying what images they like, why they like them. So bringing in that connection with the image, being able to describe it, being able to link it to a personal experience like it tells us in the Year 1 achievement standard. So they need to know that images are there for a reason and that people draw connection with those images because of different things that are in them, and that they themselves can develop a connection with an image, and it makes them feel a certain way or remember a certain thing, etc., which is then the really good foundation understanding around why big companies and people selling things use images in particular ways. So that's what we would look at in relation to the complexity difference. So the student's going to still be in the classroom, just like they were in the Year 7 example, interacting with food webs. They're still going to be interacting with persuasive advertisements and engaging in all of that teaching and learning around what images there are, why they're there, what they do. But instead of going deep into, you know, the placement, the sizing, the colour, the choice, they're going to look at more around why that image, what connection does that draw up in me, what influence does that have on me, etc. All right, let's move along now and go back a little bit. So we've gone to practice and now we're jumping quickly back to exploring the content, to go now into the level of extensive curriculum adjustments. So when we're looking at extensive curriculum adjustments, the student is accessing individual learning goals. And the curriculum and its 3D design helps us to determine what those individual learning goals are. So we can access the general capabilities. So a student on individual learning goals is not yet working toward an achievement standard from prep or foundation onwards. So it's prior to that level of achievement. So we can go to the general capabilities of literacy, numeracy, and personal and social capability, which gives us the foundational skills to then move into the prep level achievement standard. So when a student is progressing through the individual goals of the general capabilities in those areas, we're aiming to get them on to the F to 10 scope and sequence of achievement with these foundational skills that the general capability sets them up with. So there is access level 1 of the literacy, numeracy, and personal and social capability, and they are targeted prior to the foundation or prep expectation. So we can access those. Within them, there are sub-levels. So it's a different amount of sub-levels within each, but it's ranging from A to D in those sub-levels. But as I said, numeracy has less sub-levels, and so does personal and social capability, whereas the literacy one has the 5 levels there. So we are assuming, again, coming into this, that there's been a rigorous process around this being the actual level of adjustment the student requires, and there's been a big unpacking around what access level or sub-level within literacy, numeracy, and personal and social capability is the next lot of goals or working toward for this student. So we're coming into this with the assumption that that has already taken place through a rigorous process. We then apply those goals to the age equivalent learning area. So they're still going to be in Year 7 science or in our Year 4 example in our classrooms. So still engaging with food webs or still engaging with persuasive advertisements, but their focus is going to be on making progress toward these individual learning goals that they have, as opposed to an achievement standard. We need to also remember that we're going to support communication around this, and right back at the beginning of those assumptions that we're making is that people engaged in this decision making have actually ruled out the fact that communication isn't the barrier. So we need to be certain that we aren't limited to thinking that a student has a significant cognitive impact that means that they need individual learning goals, when in fact it could be that we haven't found a way for them to effectively communicate to us their knowledge and understanding. So we often see this around students who use AAC or students who don't use verbal speech to communicate. We can quickly make the assumption that because they're not giving us anything that's easy for us to access, that they don't actually know food webs and persuasive texts, when in fact they could. It could all be in there, and we just haven't had a way that supports them in getting it out. So we're coming into this making the assumption that that has been very clearly addressed, and that it is still definitely a cognitive impact and not a communication impact that is the barrier here. And being aware of that students might be still with a cognitive impact, but also might as well be communicating via a different mode, and we need to be mindful of that. Again, we don't have a real life student in mind, but there will be a real human with some real characteristics that come into consideration in this process. So for the purpose of the demonstration, we're pretending that this student, we've gone through this very rigorous process and they're accessing literacy level 1C. And I've just taken a small component of that. So it's one level of the literacy goals. There is another level of literacy goals we can access, as well as the numeracy and the personal and social capability ones, which can all be brought in to these units that we're focusing on. But time constraints, I've just drawn in just that first level of literacy capability. So students accessing literacy level 1C might be using a range of communication. It might not necessarily be spoken words, but there could be. They could be using symbols, AAC. They might not yet have a consistent communication method, etc. Again, the real human being brings that context in the next layer that's brought in when we're thinking about this stuff. But they are working toward being able to respond to sequences of gestures, objects, photographs, etc., responding to text with familiar structures and responding to requests. They're also using their communication to refuse or reject things, request items, people or events, and create texts. Remembering texts is quite a broad definition. It isn't just, you know, a written, handwritten story, for example, that texts occur in a variety of different modes. So don't be limited by what we automatically think of when we hear the word text. We think of, you know, a written book. Remember that it is a broader term than that. So being able to create texts, such as commenting on recent events, stories, or shared experiences. So what we're doing is we're understanding that, but also understanding the child and what they actually bring to allow us to think about then. And the example I've got is the Year 4 persuasive content that you've just engaged with in your breakout room, and what that might look like for a student accessing individual learning goals. So they're going to be seeing these images, these advertisements, but remembering they're back at looking at responding to things, making comment on things, refusing and rejecting things, etc. And have their own individual way of communicating that stuff. So we bring that in. So they might be looking at responding to images in an advertisement. They might be indicating which one is good, which one is bad. They might refuse or reject ones based on their own interests and what they like, etc. They might be able to comment on an advertisement, again, not necessarily via spoken language. It might be via different means around what the image, what the advertisement is showing. There might be, you'll bring in ones that have objects on it that the student's familiar with, so that they can make comment on things that are known to them, that they see, that they identify in these advertisements. And then they can make a selection, you know, refusing or rejecting or identifying and taking ones that they like, ones that appeal to them. And then they might, you know, can make comments on that around colour, shapes, those things which might come in from the numeracy goals that they're working on that are contained within that. Or you might even have the personal and social capability goals in where they're actually showing a peer the advertisement that they like, etc. So again, there's quite a lot of option here where we do need that next level of the student's means of communication and the context that comes with that as well. But plenty of opportunity for a student with a significant cognitive impact to still be engaged in their regular academic grade level curriculum with the change of focus around what that interaction looks like for them and what you're wanting them to get out of it, alongside peers who are getting something different out of it at the same time. For them, assessment isn't as formal, I suppose, is a word that you can use, and you're actually looking at making progress along those goals and heading toward that foundation achievement standard as the student demonstrates competence. So you're gathering data around the student's interaction and progression through these literacy, numeracy and personal and social capability goals all the time, and you're reflecting as a multidisciplinary collaborative team on that. So remembering these goals are across all learning areas for the student. So they are accessing the same goals in English, maths, science, etc. And it's the content and the context that is changing for them as they go from images in Year 4 English to whatever Year 4 science is, to whatever Year 4 maths is, etc. So you're going to have lots of data around the student being able to refuse and reject, being able to respond, and it's always coming back and reviewing that and moving them on to the next level when they're showing that they've made progress in those things. So we're not having to wait, you know, a semester or a year. We're able to progress students toward an achievement standard. You know, it could change week to week, for example. We're not locked in to bumping them up until they hit those achievement standards, and then they're obviously accessing those for an entire year, a 12-month period. So we can use lots of means around that data. So obviously these students are going to be communicating in a variety of individualised ways. So again, that will kind of dictate the type of data that you're gathering on them. But it could be photographs, it could be videos, it could be annotated observations, it could be work samples, lots of different things. You're not locked into them having to sit and do an essay, for example. So always reflecting and always looking for opportunity to progress the student onto the sequence of achievement. Okay, so that brings us to the end, but of course, opportunity to hang around and do some questions. So in a moment, I will pause the recording and stay on the Zoom so that you can interact with me or pop in any questions if you like. But to send you off into your evening, just some reflective prompts for you to think about. So rhetorical reflection, you don't have to enter anything into the chat if you don't want to. But thinking about what something is that you've learnt, how do you feel about that learning, and what's some action that you will take. We know that if we actually go away from professional learning and do something and do it soon after, that results in far greater use and capability around what we've just learnt about. So thinking about something that you can take away, go and put into action, learn more about, think more about, etc. And at the very beginning of the first webinar, we kicked off with this reflection. We checked in with it again at the second webinar and now finishing up as well. So thinking about our scales of 0 to 10 and what our knowledge of the flexibility of standards-based curriculum is in ensuring all students can access their academic curriculum, the same content as their peers, and what your confidence and capability is with implementing it. So people who've been with us from the beginning would have plotted at the start and now plotting at the end of 3 webinars. And hopefully seeing a little bit of movement there, but then also thinking about what else you could go forth and do to keep progressing your knowledge and your practice around providing curriculum adjustments to students. So thanks again, everyone. I will pause the recording now and hang around for any further questions or chat that you have for a little bit. And as I mentioned, the recording will be up on the website in the next couple of days, along with the PDF of the slides and the little activity that you did in your breakout sessions as well. So thanks very much.